Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Gatare site, wash process Rwanda from Verb Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Verb, based out of Boulder, Colorado. And they were a suggestion to us by Gavin Chair. A shout out to and thank you to Gavin for the suggestion. This is Verb's first ever appearance on this channel. As they're a coffee roaster, I had very limited familiarity with going into this review, and that very limited familiarity came when I visited their coffee shop for the first time back in January, and I'd always planned on purchasing 2 bags of coffee from them, given that they've been on our suggestions recommendations list for quite a while. And I was actually impressed by the 2 coffees that we did have from them in store, including a natural processed Ethiopian coffee that turned out significantly cleaner than I was expecting. So that definitely raised the bar for these 2 bags that we will be discussing, and it'll be interesting to see how they turned out, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, this one did turn out a little bit lighter than I expected going into it, as this coffee was lighter than a lot of what I've had recently from Sweet Bloom, Huckleberry, and Corvus, a lot of other Denver-based coffee roasters. So this one right here, I would say for most people is on the slightly lighter side of that medium light in terms of that roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression. Through the V60, and there was a surprisingly nice level of sweetness to the cup, as it did have a fair bit of the anticipated tea-like savoriness to it in a moderately intense sense, but there was tremendous definition to the lime attribute as well, definitely giving this one a very solid start, as I was really pleased by the wonderful clarity and definition that was present within this first try. Day 17 through the Chemex, and this one had more of that classic savory Rwandan characteristic right at the forefront, but it was definitely made for on the back end by a surprisingly high level of candied sweetness. The listed honeydew definitely felt apt, as there was a very sweet melon present within the coffee itself as well. And the definition of the lime continues to be quite well pronounced, as it's yet another solid day of this coffee. So we move on to day 20, as we opted for the April brewer, and the cup continues to remain surprisingly flavorful, as it offers a classic Rwandan coffee base with plenty of the tea-like savory aspects and slight Kenyan-like characteristics as well. The majority of the cup continues to remain super clean, with a bit of the listed melon fruits, as well as a very well-defined citric attribute, lending itself to another very nice day of this coffee. And as of this moment, I'm really surprised. For me, it's been kind of interesting with Rwandan coffees. If anybody recalls, then the Rwandan coffee that we reviewed from Nomad did suffer from the potato defect, and that put me off of Rwandan coffees for a very long time. We had also had the Rambagira from Makina a couple of years ago, where that was a very impressive coffee. So I feel like oftentimes if Rwandan coffees are done very, very well, then they do end up being way above expectation, and that's the initial impressions I had had with this coffee. Day 23, back through the V60 with our standard recipe. Said, why mess with success? As of this moment, everything we've done has turned out great. Let's not push this one. And the wonderful candied aspect continues to remain very present, as the listed honeydew is also apt with some very nice fruit sweetness to this, especially in that melon sense. Less of the savory tea aspects, as the Rwandan-like base is still present, but not quite as prominent, with plenty of the citrus still present in the finish. Another very nice day. Day 26, back through the Chemex, and the cup is the best it has been up to this point, with some of the cup being reminiscent of the sweeter candied Kenyan coffees we've had in the past, as it's still offering plenty of brightness in that berry sense as well, so that's an additional characteristic to this one. Plenty of fresh fruit and less of the earthiness, so a very nice day on this try. Day 29, back through the V60, and the cup is now offering a very well-defined candied lime attribute to it. The green tea note did feel the most apt it had up to this point, as it had some really nice tea-like depth to it as well. Some slight savory characteristics, though, that could have been a component of the Rwandan-like base that this coffee did offer. But we move on to day 32, as we ran it back through the V60, as it's another nice day. Notably strong candied sweetness yet again, with plenty of these sweeter Kenyan-like characteristics. Slightly savory with a nice bit of fresh fruit still prominent. A lot of consistency within this coffee, as I couldn't help but note a lot of the recurring characteristics, but most specifically and best was the wonderful clarity as well as sweetness that was present within it. Day 34, or final notes we have. One more try through the Chemex, and the main reason I preferred the V60 was on this final try, it did seem to have a little bit more of a focus on the savory aspects, though there's still plenty of the listed green tea components, at least as far as the earthiness goes to it. It's a slight bit more pronounced before it settles into a pretty lime-forward cup. I feel like with the V60, at least on some of the previous days to this Chemex experience, I was getting a little bit more of definition in terms of that candied sweetness and candied attribute of this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness. Level 4, well, it doesn't have the potato defect, so that's the first and best thing I can say about this Rwandan coffee, and for that reason, it definitely felt justified at the level 4 mark. But on a more serious note, there was tremendous definition to this coffee, and as far as Rwandan coffees go, I feel like this is one of the cleanest I've had. Even by Kenyan coffee standards, I do have to say that this is on the significantly cleaner side of things, so great job on the clarity, great job on the cleanliness, really appreciate that about this coffee. Finish, level 4. So once again, I feel like the finish was a little bit more on an even sense. We had a little bit of that citric finish to it, also a little bit of the savory finish to it, but neither of which were overbearing in any regard or any sense. It just had that normal, expected, anticipated finish to the coffee, so don't have too much to add to that. Sweetness, level 4. So really interesting to me about this coffee is that I found out that they use the Gießen as their roaster, and the only other coffee roaster I know that we review pretty regularly that also uses the Gießen is Coffea Circular, and their coffees tend to also offer this same type of sweetness as well with the vast majority of them that I've had. So trying those two comparisons, especially after I tried their coffee without knowing what the machine they actually used was, it was kind of interesting because in a weird way, it did remind me ever so slightly of Coffea Circular, which is very high praise, but I'm specifically referring to the sweetness specifically, as the sweetness is the first thing I noted and mentioned about this coffee because of just how much of it was present within it, and not necessarily something I was expecting going into it. Honestly, did not know what to expect from this Rwandan coffee, but the sweetness being as high as it was not quite that. Acidity, level 4. Plenty of brightness, and it did offer a Kenyan-like brightness without the Kenyan-like savoriness, so it did have the savoriness, but a little bit more on that Rwandan side of things, as opposed to being a little bit more on the tomato side of things, a little bit more on the slightly earthy side of things. But as we're discussing this brightness, I was a little surprised as it offered a fair bit of that kind of tart berry, Kenyan-like brightness to this cup. Berry fruit, level 4. As I'd kind of mentioned, it did have that kind of tart, bright berry aspect to it. But in addition to that, the melon components would fit into that category as well. So both of those things do end up giving this one a level 4 in terms of the berry fruit. Citrus fruit, level 4. So the lime, so tremendously well defined, especially from those first couple of tries. But in addition to that, at times also felt candied and definitely very well defined, very easy to pick out, one of the most well-defined lime attributes to it, but at the same time, not overbearing, so we're not seeing it score that level 5, but I do appreciate it being right there at that level 4 because of just how much definition there was to it. I am willing to kind of overlook some flavor profiles I don't necessarily like I'm not the biggest fan of lime in coffee if they're just this well done, so this is a nice little exception to me enjoying the citric fruit components within this one. Then we have quite a few level 3s. We will start with the florality, level 3. I'm kind of feeling that since this coffee was a little bit more kind of earth themed, a little bit of those red characteristics to it, then it did have a little bit of that kind of hibiscus-like component that I can feel a fair bit from Kenyan coffees that was also slightly present within this one. So that's what gets that level 3 for this part. Stone fruit, level 3. I was kind of surprised as there was enough fresh fruit where I could say there's a little bit of a stone fruit going on here. We're probably thinking a little bit more along the lines of the sugary stone fruit, so specifically something like an apricot along those lines, maybe even a little bit of a white peach, but really surprised that I was able to get as much of the stone fruit that was present within this one, though I will have to say that it is on the lower side of level 3, but enough of it and enough in a sweeter sense that it justified that level 3 mark. Savoriness, level 3, I've mentioned that before. I went into this one expecting a fair bit of savoriness given the green tea note listed on it and given that this is a Rwandan coffee, but the savoriness, at least the earthy tones of this one, were actually quite nice because they did not take away from the coffee in any regard. It kind of reminded you, you're drinking a Rwandan coffee, but at the same time, a pretty well executed Rwandan coffee. So I'm fine with the savoriness being there at that level 3. And then body at the level 3, yeah, has a fair bit of texture to it as well, so I don't think I really need to add too much to that. It just had a little bit more of a medium-bodied attribute to it, so probably what I was expecting from that part of this coffee as well. And as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one might be my favorite Rwandan coffee that we have ever reviewed on this channel. Granted, we don't review a whole lot of Rwandan coffees, but I did go into this one with some decent expectations, and it did surpass those expectations, as I was very surprised by a lot of the characteristics, most specifically the cleanliness and the sweetness that was present within this coffee. Going into it, I said, okay, as long as we don't get something that's overly savory, that's overly dominant in a direction that I don't necessarily like, it'll be a win. But we got so much more from this one, especially in regards to those components, and the definition to it was really nice. So this one took me by surprise. I do have to say that this is one of the biggest surprise coffees I've had this year, as I think they did an excellent job of it. And I would not be surprised if this ends up at least in an honorable mentions part of our coffees of the year list, mostly because this one is in that Rwandan category, and I can't also envision me reviewing too many other Rwandan coffees this year. So credits to Verb, really surprised by how this coffee turned out. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you do enjoy a lot of Rwandan coffees, then this one at least has that good start going for it with the Rwandan-like base. I mean, you're not going to miss out on that, specifically because it has those savory components, those slightly earthy components. And I feel like a lot of people that drink Rwandan coffees regularly, I mean, I don't review a lot of them, but I try them from time to time, anytime I do see them at a coffee shop, especially if they are washed. I've noticed that same sort of kind of earthy theme to them, and you can really seem to tell that you're drinking that sort of coffee. That's the first place that I would start because it's present, but it has a wonderful bit of characteristics that go alongside that as well. Clarity and sweetness specifically, plenty of citric components, and also a kind of canyon-like attribute to it in terms of the brightness, as well as the citric and berry components too. So kind of combine those things, and I feel like this is a pretty good fit, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or anything from Verb, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gatare site, wash processed Rwanda from Verb Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.